15. Matthias. When he emerged on deck, Matthias had to head straight for the railing. All of these canal rats and slum dwellers had easily found their sea legs, used to hopping from boat to boat on the waterways of Ketterdam. Only the soft one, Wylan, seemed to be struggling. He looked as poorly as Matthias felt. It was better in the fresh air, where he could keep an eye on the horizon. He'd managed sea voyages as a druskela, but he'd always felt more comfortable on land, on the ice. It was humiliating to have these foreigners see him vomit over the railing for the third time in as many hours. At least Nina wasn't here to witness that particular shame. He kept thinking of her in that cabin, ministering to the bronze girl, all concern and kindness, and fatigue. She looked so weary. "It was a mistake," she'd said. To have him branded as a slaver, tossed onto a Kerch ship, and thrown in jail? She claimed she'd tried to set things right. But even if that were true, what did it matter? Her kind had no honor. She'd proven that. Someone had brewed coffee, and he saw the crew drinking it from copper mugs with ceramic lids. The thought to bring Nina a cup entered his head, and he crushed it. He didn't need to tend to her or tell Brecker that she could use relief. He clenched his fingers, looking at the scabbed knuckles. She had seated such weakness in him. Brecker gestured Matthias over to where he, Jasper, and Wylan had gathered on the forecastle deck to examine plans of the ice court away from the eyes and ears of the crew. The sight of those drawings was like a knife to his heart. The walls, the gates, the guards. They should have dissuaded these fools, but apparently he was as much a fool as the rest of them. "Why aren't there names on anything?" Brecker asked, gesturing at the plans. "I don't know Fjerdan, and we need the details right," Wylan said. "Helvar should do it." He drew back when he saw Matthias's expression. "I'm just doing my job. Stop glaring at me." "No," Matthias growled. "Here," Kaz said, tossing him a tiny, clear disk that winked in the sun. The demon had propped himself on a barrel and was leaning against the mast, his bad leg elevated on a coil of rope, that cursed walking stick resting on his lap. Matthias liked to imagine breaking it into splinters and feeding them to Brecker, one by one. "What is it?" "One of Rask's new inventions." Wylan's head popped up. "I thought he did demo work." "He does everything," said Jesper. "Wedge it between your back teeth," Kaz said as he handed the discs to the others. "But don't bite down." Wylan started to sputter and cough, clawing at his mouth. A transparent film had spread over his lips. It bulged like a frog's gullet as he tried to breathe, eyes darting left and right in panic. Jesper started laughing, and Kaz just shook his head. "I told you not to bite down, Wylan. Breathe through your nose." The boy took deep inhales, nostrils flaring. "Easy," said Jesper. "You're going to make yourself pass out." "What is this?" asked Matthias, still holding the tiny disc in his palm. Kaz pushed his deep into his mouth, wiggling it between his teeth. "Baleen. I'd planned to save these, but after that ambush, I don't know what kind of trouble we may run into on the open sea. If you go over and can't come up for air, wiggle it free and bite down. It will buy you 10 minutes of breathing time. Less if you panic," he said with a meaningful look at Wylan. He gave the boy another piece of baleen. "Be careful with that one." Then he tapped the ice court plans. "Names, Helvar, all of them." Reluctantly, Matthias picked up the pen and ink Wylan had laid out and began to scratch in the names of the buildings and surrounding roads. Somehow, doing it himself felt even more treasonous. Part of him wondered if he could simply find a way to separate from the group once they got there, reveal their location, and thereby win his way back into the good graces of his government. Would anyone at the ice court even recognize him? He was probably believed to be dead, drowned in the shipwreck that had killed his closest friends and Commander Brum. He had no proof of his true identity. He would be a stranger who had no business in the ice court, and by the time he got anyone to listen... "You're holding back," Brecker said, his dark eyes trained on Matthias. Matthias ignored the shiver that passed through him. Sometimes it was like the demon could read minds. I'm telling you what I know. Your conscience is interfering with your memory. Remember the terms of our deal, Helvar. All right, Matthias said, his anger rising. You want my expertise? Your plan won't work. You don't even know my plan. In through the prison, out through the embassy? As a start. It can't be done. The prison sector is completely isolated from the rest of the ice court. It isn't connected to the embassy. There's no way to reach it from there. It has a roof, doesn't it? You can't get to the roof, Matthias said with satisfaction. The Druskel spend 3 months working with Grisha prisoners and guards as part of our training. I've been in the prison, and there's no access to the roof for exactly that reason. If someone manages to get out of his cell, we don't want him running around the ice court. The prison is totally sealed off from the other 2 sectors in the outer circle. Once you're in, you're in. There's always a way out. Kaz pulled the prison plan from the stack. 5 floors, right? Processing area and 4 levels of cells. So what's here, in the basement? Nothing. A laundry and the incinerator. The incinerator? Yes, where they burn the convicts' clothes when they arrive. It's a plague precaution, but... As soon as the words left Matthias' mouth, he understood what Brecker had in mind. Sweet Joe. You want us to climb 6 stories up an incinerator shaft? When does the incinerator run? If I remember right, early morning, but even without the heat, He doesn't mean for us to climb it, said Nina, emerging from below decks. Kaz sat up straighter. Who's watching Inej? Roddy, she said. I'll go back in a minute. I just needed some air. And don't feign concern for Inej when you're planning to send her climbing up 6 stories of chimney with only a rope and a prayer. The Wraith can manage it. The Wraith is a 16-year-old girl currently lying unconscious on a table. She may not even survive the night. She will, said Kaz, and something savage flashed in his eyes. Matthias suspected that Brecker would drag the girl back from hell himself if he had to. Jesper picked up his rifle, running a soft cloth over it. Why are we talking about scaling chimneys when we've got a bigger problem? And what's that? Kaz asked, though Matthias had the distinct impression he knew. We have no business going after Boljul Bayur if Pekka Rollins is involved. Who is Pekka Rollins? Matthias asked, turning the ridiculous syllables over in his mouth. Kirch names had no dignity to them. He knew that the man was a gang leader and that he lined his pockets with proceeds from the Hell Show. That was bad enough, but Matthias sensed there was more. Wylan shuddered, pulling at the gummy substance on his lips. Only the biggest, baddest operator in all of Ketterdam. He has money we don't have, connections we don't have, and probably a head start. Jesper nodded. For once, Wylan is making sense. If by some miracle we do manage to spring Boljul Bayur before Rollins does, once he finds out we're the ones who beat him to it, we're all dead men. Pekka Rollins is a barrel boss, Kaz said. No more, no less. Stop making him out to be some kind of immortal. There's something else going on here, thought Matthias. Brecker had lost the thrum of violence that seemed to drive him earlier, when he'd murdered Oomen. But there was still a lingering intensity in his words. Matthias felt sure that Kaz Brecker hated Pekka Rollins, and it wasn't just because he'd blown up their ship and hired thugs to shoot at them. This had the feel of old wounds and bad blood. Jesper leaned back and said, You think Per Haskell is going to back you when he finds out you crossed Pekka Rollins? You think the old man wants that war? Kaz shook his head, and Matthias saw real frustration there. Pekka Rollins didn't come into this world dressed in velvet and rolling in Kruger. You're still thinking small, the way Per Haskell does, the way men like Rollins want you to. We pull off this job and divvy up that haul, we'll be the legends of the barrel. We'll be the crew that beat Pekka Rollins." "Maybe we should forget approaching from the north," said Wylan. "If Pekka's crew has a head start, we should sail straight to Gerholm." "The harbor will be crawling with security," Kaz said, "not to mention all the usual customs agents and lawmen." "The south? Through Ravka?" "That border is locked down tight," Nina said. "It's a big border," said Matthias. "But there's no way to know where it's most vulnerable," she replied, "unless you have some magical knowledge about which watchtowers and outposts are active. Besides, if we enter from Ravka, we have to contend with Ravkans and Fjerdans." What she said made sense, but it unnerved him. In Fjerda, women didn't talk this way, didn't speak of military or strategic matters. But Nina had always been like that. "We enter from the north as planned," Kaz said. Jesper knocked his head against the hull and cast his eyes heavenward. "Fine, but if Pekka Rollins kills us all, I'm going to get Wyland's ghost to teach my ghost how to play the flute, just so that I can annoy the hell out of your ghost." Brecker's lips quirked. "I'll just hire Matthias' ghost to kick your ghost's ass." "My ghost won't associate with your ghost," Matthias said primly, and then wondered if the sea air was rotting his brain.
Part 3. Heartsick. 16. Inej. Everything hurt. And why was the room moving? Inej came awake slowly, her thoughts jumbled. She remembered the thrust of Uman's knife, climbing the crates, people shouting as she dangled from the tips of her fingers. "Come on down, Wraith." But Kaz had returned for her, to rescue his investment. They must have made it onto the Ferroland. She tried to roll over, but the pain was too intense, so she settled for turning her head. Nina was drowsing on a stool tucked into the corner by the table. Inej's hand grasped loosely in her own. "Nina," she croaked. Her throat felt like it was coated in wool. Nina jolted awake. "I'm up," she blurted, then peered blearily at Inej. "You're awake?" She sat up straighter. "Oh, saints, you're awake!" And then Nina burst out crying. Inej tried to sit up, but she could barely lift her head. No, Nina said. "Don't try to move, just rest. Are you okay?" Nina started to laugh through her tears. "I'm fine. You're the one who got stabbed. I don't know what's wrong with me. It's just so much easier to kill people than take care of them." Inej blinked, and then they both started laughing. "Ow," groaned Inej. "Don't make me laugh. That feels awful." Nina winced. "How do you feel?" "Sore, but not terrible. Thirsty." Nina offered her a tin cup full of cold water. "It's fresh. We had rain yesterday." Inej sipped carefully, letting Nina hold her head up. "How long was I out?" 3 days. Almost 4. "Jasper is driving us all crazy. I don't think I've seen him sit still for more than 2 minutes together." She stood up abruptly. "I need to tell Kaz you're awake. We thought—" "Wait," Inej said, grabbing for Nina's hand. Can we not tell him right away?" Nina sat back down, her face puzzled. "Sure, but—" "Just for tonight." She paused. "Is it night?" "Yes. Just past midnight, actually." "Do we know who came after us at the harbor?" "Pekka Rollins. He hired the black tips and the razor gulls to keep us from getting out of Fifth Harbor." "How did he know where we were leaving from?" "We're not sure yet." "I saw Uman." "Uman's dead. Kaz killed him." "He did?" "Kaz killed a lot of people. Roddy saw him go after the black tips who had you up on the crates. I believe his exact words were, 'There was enough blood to paint a barn red.'" Inej closed her eyes. So much death. They were surrounded by it in the barrel, but this was the closest it had ever come to her. He was afraid for you. Kaz isn't afraid of anything. You should have seen his face when he brought you to me. I'm a very valuable investment. Nina's jaw dropped. Tell me he didn't say that. Of course he did. Well, not the valuable part. Idiot. How's Matthias? Also an idiot. Do you think you can eat? Inez shook her head. She didn't feel hungry at all. Try, urged Nina. There wasn't much of you to begin with. I just want to rest for now. Of course, Nina said. I'll turn down the lantern. Inez reached for her again. Don't. I don't want to go back to sleep yet. I could read to you if I had anything to read. There's a heartrender at the little palace who can recite epic poetry for hours. Then you'd wish you had died. Inez laughed and then winced. Just stay. All right, said Nina. Since you want to talk, tell me why you don't have a cup and a crow on your arm. Starting with the easy questions? Nina crossed her legs and planted her chin in her hands. Waiting. Inez was quiet for a while. You saw my scars. Nina nodded. When Kaz got Per Haskell to pay my indenture with the menagerie, the first thing I did was have the peacock feather tattoo removed. Whoever took care of it did a pretty rough job. He wasn't a corporalnik, or even a medic. Just one of the half-knowledgeable butchers who plied their trade along the desperate of the barrel. He'd offered her a slug of whiskey, then simply hacked away at the skin, leaving a puckered spill of wounds down her forearm. She hadn't cared. The pain was liberation. They had loved to talk about her skin at the House of Exotics. It was like coffee with sweet milk. It was like burnished caramel. It was like satin. She welcomed every cut of the knife and the scars it left behind. Kaz told me I didn't have to do anything but make myself useful. Kaz had taught her to crack a safe, pick a pocket, wield a knife. He'd gifted her with her first blade, the one she called Sankt Peter. Not as pretty as wild geraniums, but more practical, she supposed. Maybe I'll use it on you, she'd said. He'd sighed. If only you were that bloodthirsty. She hadn't been able to tell if he was kidding. Now she shifted slightly on the table. There was pain, but it wasn't too bad. Given how deep the knife had gone, her saints must have been guiding Nina's hand. Kaz said, if I proved myself, I could join the dregs when I was ready. And I did. But I didn't take the tattoo. Nina's brows rose. I didn't think it was optional. Technically, it isn't. I know some people don't understand, but Kaz told me. He said it was my choice, that he wouldn't be the one to mark me again. But he had, in his own way, despite her best intentions. Feeling anything for Kaz Brecker was the worst kind of foolishness, she knew that. But he'd been the one to rescue her, to see her potential. He'd bet on her, and that meant something, even if he'd done it for his own selfish reasons. He'd even dubbed her the Wraith. I don't like it, she'd said. It makes me sound like a corpse. A phantom, he corrected. Didn't you just say I was to be your spider? Why not stick with that? Because there are plenty of spiders in the barrel. Besides, you want your enemies to be afraid, not think they can squash you with the toe of one boot. My enemies? Our enemies. He'd helped her build a legend to wear as armor, something bigger and more frightening than the girl she'd been. Inez sighed. She didn't want to think about Kaz anymore. Talk, she said to Nina. Your eyelids are drooping. You should sleep. Don't like boats. Bad memories. Me too. Sing something, then. Nina laughed. Remember what I said about wishing you were dead? You do not want me to sing. Please. I only know Ravkan folk tunes and Kirch drinking songs. Drinking song. Something rowdy, please. Nina snorted. Only for you, Wraith. She cleared her throat and began. Mighty young captain, bold on the sea, soldier and sailor and free of disease. Inej started to giggle and clutched her side. You're right. You couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. I told you that. Go on. Nina's voice really was terrible, but it helped to keep Inej on this boat. In this moment, she didn't want to think about the last time she'd been at sea, but the memories were hard to fight. She wasn't even supposed to be in the wagon the morning the slavers took her. She'd been 14, and her family had been summering on the coast of West Ravka, enjoying the seaside and performing in a carnival on the outskirts of Oskervo. She should have been helping her father mend the nets. But she'd been feeling lazy, and she'd allowed herself another few minutes to sleep in, drowsing beneath the thin cotton covers and listening to the rush and sigh of the waves. When a man had appeared silhouetted in the door to the caravan, she hadn't even known to run. She'd simply said, 5 more minutes, Papa. Then they had her by the legs and were dragging her out of the wagon. She banged her head hard on the ground. There were 4 of them, big men, seafarers. When she tried to scream, they gagged her. They bound her hands and wrists, and one of them threw her over his shoulder as they plunged into a longboat they'd moored in the cove. Later, Inej learned that the coast was a popular location for slavers. They'd spotted the Suli caravan from their ship and rowed in after dawn when the camp was all but deserted. The rest of the journey was a blur. She was thrown into a cargo hold with a group of other children, some older, some younger, mostly girls, but a few boys, too. She was the only Suli, but a few spoke Ravkan, and they told her their own stories of being taken. One had been snatched from his father's shipyard. Another had been playing in the tide pools and had strayed too far from her friends. One had been sold by her older brother to pay off his gambling debts. The sailors spoke a language she didn't know, but one of the other children claimed they were being taken to the largest of Kirch's outer islands, where they would be auctioned to private owners or pleasure houses in Ketterdam and Novia Zem. People came from all over the world to bid. Inej had thought that slaving was illegal in Kirch, but apparently it still happened. She never saw the auction block. When they'd finally dropped anchor, Inej was led on deck and handed over to one of the most beautiful women she'd ever seen, a tall blonde with hazel eyes and piles of golden hair. The woman had held her lantern up and examined every inch of Inej, her teeth, her breasts, even her feet. She'd tugged on the matted hair on Inej's head. This will have to be shaved. Then she'd stepped back. Pretty, she said. Scrawny and flat as a pan, but her skin is flawless. She'd turned away to barter with the sailors as Inej stood there, clutching her bound hands over her chest, her blouse still open, her skirt still hiked around her waist. Inej could see the glint of moonlight off the waves of the cove. Jump, she'd thought. Whatever waits at the bottom of the sea is better than where this woman is taking you. But she hadn't had the courage. The girl she'd become would have jumped without a second thought, and maybe taken one of the slavers down with her. Or maybe she was kidding herself. She'd frozen when Tanta Helene had accosted her in West Stave. She'd been no stronger, no braver. Just the same frightened Suli girl who'd been paralyzed and humiliated on the deck of that ship. Nina was still singing something about a sailor who'd abandoned his sweetheart. Teach me the chorus, Inej said. You should rest. Chorus. So Nina taught her the words, and they sang together, fumbling through the verses, hopelessly out of key, until the lanterns burned low.